Chapter 1. The Price of Genius. A rainy Tuesday afternoon cloaked London in gray. The somber clouds mirroring the mood within Hercule Poirot's immaculate flat on Pharaoh Street. The faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air, a testament to Poirot's morning ritual of personally puffing his already gleaming furniture. I sat opposite him, sipping lukewarm tea, watching his mustache twitch with irritation. Poirot was in a rare foul temper. "Mon ami," he declared, breaking the silence with a sharp edge. "Do you know the greatest injustice in this world?" I raised an eyebrow, bracing for a philosophical tirade. "What, Poirot, is that?" Hercule Poirot, world-renowned detective, solver of mysteries beyond Scotland Yard's grasp, must live like a pauper, while others, who dare call themselves detectives, parade in motorcars, in Savile Row suits. He sprang to his feet, pacing the carpet, a rare breach of his usual aversion to disorder. His hands waved dramatically. "Do you know Inspector Brand charges? Or that Harold Whitmore with his fancy Park Lane agency? Small fortunes for trifling consultations. Meanwhile, I, Hercule Poirot, am offered tea as gratitude." I nodded, hiding a smile. This wasn't Poirot's first rant about his rivals, but today's carried an unusual urgency, a personal sting. "And why do I endure this indignity?" he continued, pausing to face me, arms crossed. "Because I have standards, principles, but no more. From now on, I charge what I am worth." "Let me guess," I said dryly. "Mrs. Holloway raised the rent again." A guilty flicker crossed his face. "Relevant," he muttered, smoothing his mustache. "She is a woman of expensive tastes and a sharper tongue." I chuckled. Mrs. Holloway, his landlady, was infamous for her pointed remarks about men who polished faces instead of paying fair rent. Clearly, she'd cornered him earlier. I was about to offer reassurance when the doorbell rang. Who dares disturb Hercule Poirot in his hour of indignation? He grumbled, sinking back onto the sofa. I opened the door to a postman dripping under an umbrella. "Good afternoon," he said briskly. "Letter from Mr. Poirot. Personal delivery. Urgent." "Poirot's not in the best mood," I replied with a half smile. "Take it." He handed me the envelope and vanished into the misty street. I turned it over. Elegant, feminine handwriting spelled Jennifer above a Kensington address with no return message. "Poirot," I said, passing it to him. "Looks like someone still values your services. Maybe even enough to pay proper fees." He examined the seal, then sliced it open with his silver letter opener. As he read, his frown dissolved, replaced by keen curiosity. When he finished, he looked up, all traces of frustration gone. "Mon ami," he said, rising. "A lady in distress summons Hercule Poirot. She requires immediate help. We must go to her at once." "Do we know the trouble?" I asked. "She does not say, only that it is urgent and we must drop everything." "Well," I said, grabbing my coat, "dropping everything is our specialty." Poirot gave a tight nod, already donning his hat and gloves with military precision. 5 minutes later, we were in a cab bound for Kensington. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the city a blur of damp bricks and umbrella-dotted pavements. Poirot sat in silence, tapping his knee, a sign of deep thought. The latter had ignited something in him beyond the usual call for help. Chapter 2. The Queen's Corsetti cab wound through the narrowing London streets like a silent carriage on a solemn mission. The rain had softened it, a whisper tapping gently against the windows, and the fog was beginning to less. Yet the mood between Poirot and me remained dense with the quiet expectation. The letter from Jennifer had stirred something beyond professional curiosity in Poirot. It had unsettled him, and Poirot, as he learned over the years, did not unsettle easily. The taxi eventually stopped before a grand Victorian townhouse in West Hampstead. The building stood solemn and tall, its ivy draped. Brick walls, tinged with age and the melancholy of a family in mourning. Poirot stepped out, first brushing a speck of dust from his neatly pressed overcoat. I followed, pulling my hat low to shield myself from the damp wind that blew along the avenue. Poole pressed the brass bell, and within moments the door creaked open. A woman in her early 40s stood before us. She was pale, though not from illness. It was the pallor of wearing Nesher dark. Hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes rimmed with shadows that spoke of sleepless nights. Yet there was a firmness in her posture, a dignity in her sadness. "You must be Mr. Poirot," she said softly, and Captain Hastings-Pugh inclined his head. "At your service, madame." "You are Jennifer?" "Yes," she replied. "I am the one who wrote to you. Please come in." She led us through a quiet hallway, lined with somber portraits. In Dinto, a drawing room where the curtains were half drawn, letting in the moody, gray light of the afternoon. The furniture was tastefully arranged, but something about the space felt untouched, like a room waiting for someone. "Why never return? Please make yourselves comfortable," she said, gesturing toward the chairs. "I'll bring you some water." As she left the room, I leaned toward Pearl and whispered, "What do you think? A family dispute?" Poole shook his head gently. "No, mon ami. I sensed it from the letter, and sense it more strongly now. There is fear in her eyes, but not the kind born of suspicion. This is the fear of someone being watched or hunted." Before I could respond, Jennifer returned, carrying a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses of water. She placed them before us with a polite nod, then sat opposite, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "Terribly sorry to summon you like this," she began. "I know you must be busy with far more serious matters." Poirot raised a hand. "Gently, madame. Every case is serious to those who live within it. Please tell us what troubles you." Jennifer's gaze fell to the floor, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "My husband, Oliver. He was a renowned archaeologist, passionate, brilliant, healed for his work, and it was his work that took him to Egypt last month." "Hid it there?" Poirot nodded with solemn respect. "I am very sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, her eyes shimmering but tears refusing to fall at first. "They said it was a heart attack, sudden, peaceful, but what happened after? That's what's tormenting me." She took a shaky breath. Oliver wasn't alone in Egypt. He had gone there with his close friend Lucas, a wealthy man who had agreed to finance the expedition, and Lucas's nephew, Henry. The 3 of them were working on an excavation near the Valley of the Kings. Oliver believed they were close to something monumental. What was it? They hoped to find Poole Eskidno sitting forward slightly. Jennifer hesitated. He believed they had located the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut, and not just the tomb, the actual undisturbed mummy of the Queen. Hercule, with limited knowledge of Egyptology, felt the weight of the name. That would indeed be a remarkable discovery. Poirot said. "It was," she whispered. "They found her, or so Oliver's notes say, but the very day they brought mummy into the open, he collapsed and died." There was silence for a moment. Poirot didn't interrupt, letting her continue at her own speech. "Days later, Lucas was poisoned. They say it was in his tea, but no one knows you could have done it. And a week after that, Henry, poor gentle Henry, was found in his tent. They say it was suicide." Jennifer paused, her breath trembling now. Local press in Cairo started calling it the curse of Hatshepsut, said her spirit awakened when her tomb was violated, that the deaths were punishment. Shifted uneasily in my seat. I had heard tales like this before, ancient curses, mysterious deaths, but 3 in a row. Poirot cleared his throat softly. "And you, madame, do you believe there is truth to this curse?" Jennifer looked him square in the eye. "I didn't know. I want to say no. I want to believe, there's a logical explanation. But her voice faltered. I'm not here to ask you to investigate the deaths. What's done is done. I've buried my husband, that pain. Of that I've accepted. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Then how? May we be of help? It's my son, she said, voice cracking. For the first time he's gone to Egypt. I insisted on retrieving Oliver's personal effects himself, and when he returned, he was changed, distant, obsessive, and then, well, days ago, he flew back to Cairo. He wants to finish his father's work. Poirot's expression grew more serious. I begged him not to go, but he wouldn't listen. And now, I'm terrified. I've had no word from him. He's working at the same site, sleeping in the same camp. If this curse is real, if something is happening out there, I fear I'll lose him too. She looked between us with desperation plays. Mr. Poirot, I don't care what you believe, curse or no curse. Just go to Egypt. Protect him. Find out what's going on. Keep him safe. He's all I have left. Poirot stood slowly, his hands behind his back. My dame, I will go to Egypt, but I must warn you, in this case may require timber sources and considerable risk. I do not usually speak of such things, but I will ask a higher fee. Jennifer nodded instantly. Take whatever you need, just bring. My son, back alive. Poole looked at me. Pack your bags. Okay, Hastings leave tomorrow. And with that, we took our leave from the grieving widow's home. Our minds already shifting from the rain-slicked streets of London to the transient sands of Egypt, where something far more sinister than a desert wind awaited us. Chapter 3 of Spirits and Spells. The London sky had grown darker by the time Poirot and I climbed into the back seat of a black cab. Rain clung to the windows like nervous sweat, and the low hum of the engine seemed almost conspiratorial in its rhythm. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes as we pulled away from Jennifer's house, the weight of her story still pressing heavily on our minds. I glanced sideways at Poirot, who sat unusually silent, his gloved hands folded neatly on his lap, his mustache twitching. Would thought I had known him long enough to recognize something disturbed him, and clearly something about this case had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Still, something tugged at my curiosity. Poirot, I began hesitantly. I know this sort of question might sound strange coming from me, but do you believe in spirits, hosts, supernatural forces? He didn't turn to look at me, but his voice was calm and deliberate when he replied, yes, Hastings, I do believe in supernatural forces. I blinked, turning fully to face him. Since when? Poirot finally met my eyes. There was no smile on his lips, no trace of mockery. Belief is a curious thing, mon ami, he said softly. One does not need to have seen a ghost to believe in the shadow it casts. Do not speak of phantoms in white sheets or moaning wraiths, but I believe there are energies. We do not fully understand forces that under certain conditions might influence, the human mind or even fate itself. I stared at him, genuinely stunned. This was the same man who had once scoffed at a seance in Brighton and exposed a famous medium as a fraud within 10 minutes. And now, here he was, speaking seriously, even respectfully, off, unknown, still not quite recovered. I pressed further. Then what would you say about Hatshepsut? Do you believe her spirit might actually be behind what's happened? There was a long pause. The taxi's wheels splashed through puddles, and a faint mist crawled along the curbside. It is possible, Poirot said at last. Time. That was when I truly felt the ground shift beneath me. Poirot, you ultimate man of logic, the inspector of detail, the worshipper of method. It was possible that a 3,000-year-old Egyptian queen was murdering from beyond the grave. I leaned back in my seats, speechless. We rode in silence the rest of the way home, each of us caught an iron web of thoughts. When the cab finally rolled to a stop beside our building, Poirot paid the driver with his usual exactness and stepped out. I need toast top, by the market," he said, adjusting his hat. "There is a particular item I must purchase. You go on ahead." Hastings began packing for Egypt. I nodded, still too dazed to respond with any thankless. Poirot tipped his hat and disappeared into the foggy lane, leaving me. To make my way up to our flat, I unlocked the door, flicked on the light, and stood in the quiet living room for a moment, unsure what to do. Next tipped, to tomb occurs 3 mysterious deaths, and now Poirot buying what supplies to fight a ghost. I shook the thoughts from my head and began pulling out a suitcase, shirts, trousers, my field journal, a camera, all the usual things, but my mind wasn't unpacking. It kept circling back to that word, possible. Not probable, not definite, but possible. An hour passed. Maybe Moray had nearly finished folding the last of my clothes when I heard the front door open, and Poirot's familiar foot clicking against the floor. He entered the room holding a single paper wrapped package. His overcoat was slightly damp, and a trace of night air followed him. "And you were gone quite a while," I said, trying to sound casual. "There was a delay," he replied, simply removing his gloves, "but I have found what I was looking for." He placed the package on the table and carefully peeled back. The paper inside was a thick, dark-bound book with faded gold lettering. I leaned forward. "Aqua Practices and Protective Rituals of the Ancient World, Pharaoh." "What on earth is this?" Poirot removed his hat, coat, and set them aside before replying. "It is a study," he said, "on how ancient civilizations viewed and protected themselves from unseen forces, spells, rituals, symbols. It may prove useful." I couldn't stop myself. "Useful? Since when do you believe in magic books and curses?" "This isn't like you." He looked at me, not with annoyance, but with something more. "Like gravity, Hastings," he said gently. "In a case where 3 men are dead, where fear runs deeper than logic, it is wise to investigate not only what is, but what others believe to be true. The boy in Egypt believes in this curse. If others at the site do as well, then fear itself becomes the enemy, and fear, mon ami, can be far more fatal than poison." I didn't reply. What could I say? As always, Poirot's reasoning held firm, even when it veered into the bizarre. It was never without purpose. He picked up the book and turned the pages slowly, eyes scanning symbols and ancient hieroglyphs. After a few minutes, looked up at me. "You should get some rest," he said. "We leave for Egypt in the morning." I nodded, more tired than I realized. As I made my way toward the bedroom, I glanced back once to see Poirot seated in his armchair, utterly absorbed in the strange old book. The lamplight flickered across the gold-inked pages, as if casting spells of its sound that night as I drifted into sleep. I thought not of logic, nor reason, nor plans for our journey. Instead, beneath centuries of sand, a queen with secrets yet unearthed, and Poirot, the great detective, quietly reading a book on breaking spells, and for the first time wondered if perhaps we weren't going to solve a mystery, but to walk straight into one chapter. For into the sands of the dead, first light of dawn was just beginning to glow behind the soot-streaked rooftops of Kalala when Poirot and I stepped onto the train platform. A cold wind whipped through the station, tugging at our coats as we boarded the European Express. It was the beginning of a long and weird journey, one that would take us across borders, over land and sea, into the heart of one of the world's oldest mysteries. Our route through Europe was uneventful. A squanty Poirot, who usually enjoyed the structure and comfort of train travel, spent most of the time reading and dozing lightly, though I noticed a constant furrow in his brow. The thought of the heat, the sand, and the unpredictability of Egypt seemed to have placed him in a preemptive state of irritation. Once we reached the port city of Bendesi, where boarded a steamer bound for Alexandria. The sea voyage took nearly a week. Why should a modest cabin and though the food was tolerable, the air was thick and stuffy. Each day, blurred into the next ace waves, rolled endlessly beneath us. Poirot was unusually restless, pacing the deck more than reading often, muttering about sand in the shoes and sun on the neck. By the time we arrived in Alexandria, the sun was hanging high over the ancient harbor, like a molten coin. Even though it was just morning, the heat was overwhelming. Sand clung to everything, our shoes, our luggage, even the creases off our clothing. The moment we stepped off the ship, Poirot began sneezing from dust in the air. This, he declared, brushing imaginary grit from his lapel, is not an environment designed for a man of refinement. Dispodious discomfort. We made arrangements for a local guide to take us inland. Our final destination was a camp located near the Valley of the King's War Lover. Lucas and Henry had met their strange fates to reach it. However, we had tow trade trains and ships for a far more primitive mode of transport. Camel's limp. Say this plainly, riding a camel is no pleasure. Within 20 minutes of mounting lumbering beast, I was certain my spine had been rearranged. The heat pressed down like a furnace, and the air shimmered with mirages. The animal beneath me groaned and stumbled with each step, jostling me relentlessly. Ittered to see how Poirot was faring, and nearly burst out laughing. If I hadn't felt so miserable myself. He looked like a man who had been personally betrayed by nature. His usually pristine suit was askew. His tie clung to his neck like a noose, and he gripped the saddle with both hands, as if expecting the camel to back him into the sand at any moment. This, he hissed. His barbarous sensually mercy came in the form of a kind-hearted guide who offered to transfer Poirot to a muleth detective, agreed with something between gratitude and disdain, dismounting the camel with a groan of relief. The mule, slower, but far more stable, suited him far better. At long last, the jagged rocks of our destination rose in the distance, and we arrived at the excavation site. The camp was a modest cluster of tents and makeshift wooden structures nestled between the small ridges. The sun was beginning to set, casting everything in a haunting amber-hued dust. Rose in gentle curls from the earth, and even the tent stumps seemed coated in the endless sand. 3 men sat beneath a canopy drinking tea. They looked up as we approached. The first was a young man no more than 20, though at first glance I might have guessed him closer to 35. The desert had not been kind to him. His skin had tanned unevenly, his lips weary, and his eyes had a hollow, sunburnt look. He stood and greeted us with a tired but polite smile. "My name is Leo," he said. "Sir Lucas had hired me to help with personal errands around the camp." Poirot nodded. "Bonjour, Mr. Leo. Thank you for receiving us." The second man, lean and pale, with a sharp nose and tightly combed hair, stepped forward. "I'm Jack," he said. "I handled all of Sir Lucas's finances during the excavation." His handshake was firm, but I noticed a tightness in his jaw. Whether from fatigue or tension, I couldn't be sure. Then came the third man, slightly older, stockier, with spectacles perched low on his nose and a sun hat resting in his lap. "I'm Dr. George," he said, "anesthesiologist. I work closely with Oliver on this stick." Poirot's mustache twitched. Ah yes, Oliver was also anesthesiologist. "No." George nodded solemnly. "Yes, he and I were the literaires here. Our work was progressing well until the tragedies Pharaoh paused, and Oliver's son, is he, Hercule, spoke up. He stepped out not long ago. He should return shortly. I can take you to a quieter camp nearby, where you can rest, merci." Pooh said, clearly grateful. Fourth offer. Leo led us down a narrow path toward another set of tents. The sand here was finer, almost like powder, and the wind carried it into every corner. Our new shelter was modest: 2 canvas tents, a small table, and a few cots. But after the long journey, it felt like a palace. We dropped our bags and collapsed on TSCs with the weight of exhaustion pressing down harder than the desert. Hercule Poirot lay back, head still on his chest, eyes already closed. "Hastings," he murmured without opening them. "Tomorrow we begin tonight. We sleepened." So we did, with the wind whispering across the sands, like voices from Longago, and the darkness of the Egyptian night folding over us like a curtain drawn before a play chapter. 5 at death before sunrise, sky above. The desert had barely begun to blush with the first hints of dawn when a piercing voice shattered stillness. "He's dead. He's dead." I bolted upright from my cot, heart thumping in my chest to Poirot, already awake and seated at the edge of his bed with a cup of warm water in hand, turned sharply toward the tent entrance. The flap burst open, and Leo peered, his face pale beneath the grime of sand, and sweat his eyes wide with panic, but stood calmly. "Who is dead?" he asked, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "A son, Kelp." Son Leo shook his head rapidly, breathing hard. "No, not him. It's Jack. Jack is dead." That name sent a jolt through me. Jack Lucas's financial secretary. The man who had greeted us just yesterday with a tight smile and sharp words. "Dead, Poirot," said. "Show us." We hurried after Leo, who led us across the sandy path to the central tent. As we stepped inside, the air was thick with heat and tension. George stood beside a low cot, his expression grim, his hands folded tight lie in front of him. Jack lay motionless, his head slumped to one side. His lips were slightly parted, a faint trace of something darkened at their corners. On the table beside him sat a ceramic cup, still half filled with amber coloradia. Poirot approached the scene with methodical care, his sharp eyes scanning everything: the position of the body, the creases in the bed linen, the untouched half of toast on the tray beside the cup. "What happened?" he asked George without preamble. George exhaled. "Jack drank poison tea. I believe ether panned early this morning. He was in the habit of waking before sunrise too. Half his tea alone. Said it helped him stay focused." Poirot bent slightly to inspect the teacup, lifting it delicately by the rim with a handkerchief. He sniffed the contents, then carefully set it back down. "Poison," George repeated. "That's my conclusion, judging by the state of Thebedy. I'd estimate he died less than an hour ago." Leo, who had been standing awkwardly near the door, suddenly spoke. I think Jack must have taken his own life. He was terrified all thoughts of this. The talk of the curse," he kept saying. "He was next." Poirot turned his gaze toward the young man, the spirit of Hatshepsut. "You mean?" Leo nodded. "Everyone's talking about it first. Oliver, then Lucas, then Henry, and now Jack." Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, his gaze drifting not just over the body, but the surroundings, the neatness of the table, the stacked journals, the recently burned incense on the shelf. At last, he turned to George, who was in the camp last night. "It's just me, Jack, and Leo," George replied. "We were all in our tents before midnight." Poirot's eyes narrowed in. "Oliver's son, was he with you?" George shook his head. "Number. He didn't come back last night. He said something about going into the city." Poirot made a small sound in his throat, not surprise, not doubt, but something more thoughtful. He stepped back from the body and gave a brief nod. "Send for the police," he said. "They must be informed." By now, the sun had begun to climb over the horizon, casting long shadows across camp. As the body was covered in messages dispatched, a heavy silence fell. The workers moved more cautiously. The whispers had already begun. Just as Poirot and I returned to our own tent, a group of Egyptian officers arrived, their car uniforms and stern expressions breaking the quiet gloom. Their leader, a wiry man with deep lines etched into his forehead, introduced himself as Inspector Mustafad. Wasted no time. After speaking to George and Leo briefly, He turned to Poirot. "You are Hercule Poirot?" he asked, and clipped. English Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, Inspector, I am he." Mustafa's eyes narrowed. "All of Egypt speaks your name. Many here hoped you would come. The people are afraid too. Many deaths. They say the tomb is cursed. They believe the Queen's spirit kills those who disturbed her." Poirot offered a faint, enigmatic smile. "Perhaps they are right, Inspector, perhaps. There is another explanation." The inspector didn't press further. Instead, he ordered Jack's body to be taken for post-mortem, and his belongings sealed for examination. Was then in the middle of this uneasy atmosphere that a shadow appeared at the edge of the camp. A tall young man walked toward us, his face drawn, his clothes dusty from travel. He looked like someone who had carried too much grief for too long. Hollow eyes, a weary posture. There was no need for an introduction. "Salai's son," Poirot murmured beside me. The young man stepped forward, nodding gallantly to the gathered officers before turning to us. "I'm James," he said. "James Howarth. I assume you've heard what's happened." Poole extended a hand. "Mr. Howarth, I'm Hercule Poirot, and this is Captain Hastings. We have come at your mother's request." James's eyes flicked briefly toward me, then returned to Poirot. "She sent you. She is deeply concerned for your safety," Poole said gently. "And with what has transpired here, I can't understand why." James looked down. "I just arrived. I stayed in the city last night. He needed time to clear my head. When I heard the news, I came straight back." Poole studied him carefully. "You were not here when Jack died?" "Numberone didn't even know until just now." Poirot nodded, saying nothing further for the moment. But I knew from experience that silence in Poirot's world often meant careful analysis. We offered James some time to settle himself, and the rest of the day passed in a cloud of grief and nervous murmurs. Workers at the site began to grow restless. Some demanded to leave with our state, but only out of obligation. The fear of Hatshepsut's wrath, or the idea of it, had sunk deep into their hearts. That evening, as the campfire flickered beneath the emerging stars, Poirot and I sat quietly. Hadn't spoken much since Jack's death, but I could sense his thoughts were far from idle. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "when a man dies alone with a cup of tea beside him, people soon the answer lies in the cup." I looked at him. "But perhaps," Poirot said, "the answer lies in who gave him the tea, or whether he ever poured it at all." I frowned. "You don't believe it was suicide?" Poole shook his head slightly. "I believe, mon ami, that someone here is orchestrating a tragedy far more human and far more deliberate than any spirit could devise." He looked out over the camp, where shadows moved silently between tents and whispers drifted like sand in the wind. "And I intend to find out who." Chapter 6. The fear in Leo's eyes. The sun hovered above the desert like a blazing eye, unblinking and relentless as the day wore on. After the shock of Jack's death, Poirot requested that all personnel step outside the camp's main structure to allow for private questioning. The inspector gave the order without hesitation. Soon the area was cleared of workers, guards, and bystanders. Only 4 of us remained inside. Poole, Leo, the Egyptian inspector, and myself. Leo sat on a folding chair opposite Poirot, looking visibly shaken. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his hands fidgeted in his lap, and he avoided direct eye contact. Poole, sitting calmly with legs neatly crossed, began in his usual precise manner. "Monsieur," he sagely, "we shall begin our inquiries with you. It is important that you speak with honesty and calmness. Tell me, Wadi, good, you know about the deaths that have taken place here?" Leo looked up, eyes widened, sunken with anxiety. I know only what I've seen, sir, but I'm convinced it's all the work of Queen Hatshepsut's spirit." Poirot arched an eyebrow, remained silent. Allowing him to continue, Leo leaned forward. lowering his voice, as though afraid the walls might hear Sir Oliver. He was the first. He died of a heart attack, yes, but it wasn't natural. He was terrified in the days before his death. Kept having dreams, nightmarish. Said he saw eyes watching him from the tomb. He was obsessed, he said. We disturbed something sacred. Poirot nodded slowly. And the next death, Seleucus. Leo swallowed. He died 2 days later, poisoned. Everyone knew he never took risks with his food or drink, but that morning he insisted on having tea brewed himself. No one else touched it, and yet he was gone before noon. Poirot's voice remained calm, and Henry Leo flinched slightly at the name Henry had changed after. Lucas died. He grew withdrawn. He started scratching himself constantly. These blisters started dappering. All over his arms, chest, even his back. It was like something was eating at him from inside. He said he felt cursed. People said it was the Queen's wrath, her revenge for disturbing her rest. Henry began saying she'd market him and that she wouldn't let him go. Pooh tilted his head. You said Henry had blisters. What kind of illness was it exact? Leo shook his head. I don't know the medical name, sir. Just read raised bumps like burns. They looked painful. He tried ointments, but nothing helped. He barely ate, couldn't sleep, and then, one morning, we found him. He had taken his own life. Poirot's fingers came together beneath his chin. Did he ever see a doctor? Leo hesitated, said there was no point. No doctor can cure a curse. That's what he said. But George, he gave him some medicine. Tried to help. Pooh leaned back. Slightly interesting now. Tell me, what was Henry's relationship with his uncle? So Lucas Leo's expression shifted slightly. There was something tight about his mouth. Now not good. They fought often. Henry always needed money. Said he wanted to start his own dig, publish his own findings. But Sir Lucas, you know, he didn't trust him with funds. Thought Henry was reckless. He refused him every time. And how did Henry respond to that? He hated it. Called his uncle selfish, controlling. Once he even said he wished he could be rid of him, but I thought he was just venting. Poirot gave a small note. And Jack, who found his body first? I didn't. Leo answered immediately. I was asleep in my tent drive. George woke me up, said he found Jack dead. I ran with him to see Jack was just lying there. The tea was still beside him. Pooh observed him for a long moment. Did Jack say anything odd to you recently? Anything troubling? Leo looked away. He'd started getting nervous. Jumpy, said someone was watching him. He kept asking about the curse. Said he was next. I think he'd believe it. Pooh leaned forward slightly. And you do? You believe it? Leo's lips trembled. I didn't, not at first, but Noah looked around the tent nervously, for people are dead. All connected to the tomb now. Jack, he was fine the night before. He even laughed at dinner, but now he looked Poirot in the eye. I think she's coming for all of us. Poirot said nothing for a moment, then quietly he nodded. Thank you, Leo. That will be all. Please ask Dr. George to come in next. Leo stood, his legs unsteady, and with a quiet yes, sir, stepped out of the tent. Poirot turned to the inspector, who had remained silent throughout, watching like a hawk, a man in fear. Poirot said softly, tells many truths and buries others beneath us. Fear, the blisters, the tea, the quarrels with Lucas. It is a good start. Inspector merely grunted and folded his arms. Poirot turned to Hastings. Did you notice Leo says Henry refused to see a doctor yet somehow? Dr. George gave him medicine that suggests trust or desperation, and Lucas refused Henry money. And yet, Henry may have stood to inherit something after his uncle's death. It is motive, perhaps, or merely shadows. Stood and adjusted his coat. But now, let us hear what Dr. George has to say. Facts are like the pieces of a puzzle, mon ami. And slowly, the air beginning to fit chapter 7 through ash and artifacts. The late afternoon sun cast long, dagger-like shadows across the sand as Dr. George entered. the camp, his sleeves rolled up, and his expression tight with weariness. The canvas walls of our temporary shelter flapped gently in the dry wind, but the tension within the tent felt heavier than the desert. He pulled sitting side a small wooden table, quietly reached into his satchel and produced a thick, dark-bound book, its corners worn, its pages yellowed by age. He placed it deliberately on the table, letting the air settle before speaking. This, he said, looking directly at George, is a book on protective rituals meant to guard against magic and spirits. Dr. George raised an eyebrow. You brought me here for this? Poirot remained composed. You asked why I came to Egypt, Doctor. It is not merely to question, it is to understand. Everyone here believes that Queen Hatshepsut's spirit has awakened, and that deaths are her revenge. George crossed his arms, his tone clipped. I am Amen of Science, Ms. Poirot. I don't have time for ghost story spew. Nodded slowly, and yet science has not explained the chain of events that has unfolded here, has it? Dr. George scoffed. You're wasting time. Thought you were a detective, not a magician. Turning to the inspector, who stood nearby, George pointed toward Poirot. With all due respect, Inspector, this man doesn't sound like an investigator. He sounds like a fraud playing into superstition. Pooh, unshaken, folded his hands. Don't calm yourself, Doctor. I did not ask you to believe in ghosts. I asked you whether you see a pattern, a logical connection between the deaths of Sir Oliver, Sir Lucas, and young Henry George. Glanced toward the tent flap as though considering whether to walk out right then. He said flatly, I don't see a connection. One had a heart attack, one was poisoned, and one took his own life. Coincidence, or the stress of being Hercule Poirot studied him for a long moment, then nodded gently. Very well, Doctor. Are you free to go? George didn't hesitate. He turned and strode out the flap, snapping shut behind him. The inspector turned to Poirot. Do you believe he is hiding something? Poirot's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. I believe he is hiding many things. Problem is deciding which are lies and which are merely shields. Then, without looking away from Theodore Way, Poirot spoke again. We must now search their belongings, aloft them. The answer, I believe, is no longer hidden in the sand beneath, but in something left behind. Without delay, we set out to inspect the camps. The sun was now low on the horizon, casting a burnt orange hue across the landscape. Shadows grew, longer tents fluttered somewhere. In the distance, a falcon cried out. The workers had retreated to the far edges of the site, murmuring their prayers beneath their breath. Chapter 8. The curse that wasn't the desert wind stirred softly as the sun began its slow descent behind the dunes, casting a golden haze over the excavation camp. The tension in the air was palpable. Word had spread quickly that Poirot, the world-renowned detective, had called for Agatha. One by one, the remaining members of the dig emerged from their tents, curious and anxious, some clutching scarves against the swirling dust, others whispering among them. Sylvester, still pale and shaken from recent events, stood near the entrance of the main tent. James Oliver's son stood quietly, arms folded, his face unreadably. Few Egyptian workers hovered near the edge of the group, eyes wide with suspicion, still murmuring about the curse of a hatchet suit. The inspector stood with his officer silent but alert. Poirot waited until everyone was present. Stepping forward, with a deliberate calm, he cleared his throat and said, May, thank you for joining me today. I bring you two important announcements. He reached into his coat pocket and held up the worn, leather-bound book he had carried from London, the one filled with ritual symbols and protective rites from ancient civilizations. Sissy said, You will all be pleased to know that I have found the solution to the curse of Hatshepsut. He paused, letting the dramatic weight of his words settle in the room. According to this book, a ritual has been completed, a ritual that frees the queen's spirit from her Unreal gasps rippled through the group. Some looked relieved, others simply looked puzzled. But Poirot continued, lowering the book more importantly. I have uncovered the truth behind the deaths that have haunted this expedition. Each of them, I assure you, had nothing to do with a vengeful spirit. Instead, they were the result of something far more human: greed, betrayal, and manipulation. Now, the silence was absolute. Surveyed the crowd and began, I cannot speak in certainty about Oliver's death. It appears to have been an atrial heart attack, but what followed was no accident. Sir Lucas and Jack were both poisoned, and young Henry, poor boy, was crime-driven to take his own life. The inspector stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Are you saying this wasn't through work of catch-up spirit? Poirot turned to him slowly. No, Inspector. It was not. The hand behind these deaths belonged to someone very much alive, Dr. George. All eyes swiveled to Dr. George, who stood among the group, lips parted in disbelief. His face flushed a dark red. What nonsense is this? He barked. You accuse him. Poirot, unshaken, calmly reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper and a small paper-wrapped packet. He held them up. This, he said, is the medicine he gave to Henry. And this, he unfolded. The document is a copy of Sir Lucas' will. He handed both items to the inspector. Poirot turned back to Dr. George. You were treating Henry for his mysterious skin condition, a rash that covered his body with painful blisters. But that condition was no curse. It was the result of this extremely harsh irritant medication. You gave it to him. You knew what it would do. Dr. George's jaw tightened. It was a common compound pool, interrupted one, used in small controlled doses, not in the strength you administered. Henry was not cursed. He was tortured, grew desperate, ashamed, and terrified. You knew what that medicine would do. You told him it was the only solution. You suggested, perhaps even subtly encouraged, that death was the only escape. He believed you. Poirot turned to the group. Everyone else believed the narrative that followed, that the ancient queen had cursed him. A collective murmur rose. Frowned crowd, rippling outward like a wave. Poirot wasn't finished yet. Cayment, he continued, lifting the will again, states that upon Sir Lucas' death, his entire fortune would pass to his nephew Henry. But if Henry to Loretto died, the estate would then pass to Dr. George. Dr. George's face burned with rage. He stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at Poirot. You think you could stand there and accuse me with legends and papers that proves nothing? Poirot looked him in the eye. Then, allow me to ask, why did you lie about the medicine? Why did you claim to have no knowledge of Henry's illness when we found clinical notes in your tent detailing every symptom? Dr. George's fists clenched. The camp held its breath, and then the dam broke. His voice cracked after Oliver died. Lucas was ready to shut everything down. He said we had no right to go on that. Oliver was the real expert, and that without him the dig was meaningless. He wanted to pull funding pack up and go home. His voice rose bitter with resentment. I begged him not to. I tried to convince him, but he didn't trust me. He said I had no vision. Knowing her, he would have thrown me aside like a failed assistant. He looked up, fury radiating from him, so I killed him. Gasps filled the air. No one moved. Poirot remained still. And Henry, I told him he'd inherited it all, that he could fund the project, finish what his father started. At first, he agreed, but then he too began pulling away. He said he didn't want to be part of something cursed. I couldn't let him leave. I needed his name, his money. He took a deep breath, so I gave him the allocation. I knew what it would do. I told him if he wanted to be free of the pain, there was only one way, and he took it. A dead silence hung in the air. Then Poirot asked his final question. And Jack, why did he die? Dr. George's face twisted. He was my partner in all this. He helped me forge supply documents, shift funds. But then he got greedy. He found out about the will, started blackmailing, demanded a cut, or he'd go to the police. He sneered. So I gave him what he gave Lucas's poison. The entire camp stood in stunned silence, suppressing the weight of what had just been confessed. The myth of the curse had been shattered. The inspector took a slow step forward and motioned to his officers. Arrest him. The officers moved swiftly. George didn't resist, perhaps. Deep down, he knew his end had been coming as he was led away in chains. Poirot stepped back, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. Leo, trembling finally, Spikiso. There was no curse. Pooh gave him a faint smile. No curse, only greed, only murdered. James Oliver's son turned to Poirot. Thank you for uncovering the truth, Poirot. Gave you modest nod. Justice MC should never be buried, not beneath gold, not beneath sand, not even beneath myth. The sun finally disappeared behind the dunes, casting the last golden light over the excavation site. The ghost of Queen Hatshepsut, it seemed, had been laid to rest. Not by magic, but by reason, by truth, and by the unshakable logic of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 9. The Final Revelation. Golden sands of Egypt were far behind us now. A cool breeze swept across the deck of the steamer as we made our slow but steady journey back to Europe. Poirot sat across from me on a sunlit bench, his mustache as neatly styled as ever, his suit impeccably pressed. Despite the long travel beside us sat James Howells, Oliver's son, who remained mostly quiet, occasionalist in thought as he stared across the endless sea. Had been several days since George's dramatic confession and arrest. The illusion of a curse had lifted, leaving behind the unsettling truth of greed, manipulation, and calculated murder plot. One question still lingered in my mind, one that had been bothering me since that evening when Poirot held up his magic book and declared he had broken Queen Hatshepsut's curse. Unablato contained my curiosity any longer. I turned to him and asked, Poirot, tell me anything, honestly, or by. Why did you put on that whole act with the book, the curse, the ritual, all of it? I've known you long enough to know that you don't believe in ghosts or spirits, so why pretend? Poirot's eyes sparkled with amusement. He tilted his head slightly and smiled, a knowing smile that he'd come to recognize over the years. A.M. Share. Hastings, he said, who told you I do not believe in supernatural powers? I frowned, unsure how to respond. Well, you've always dismissed seances, mediums, tarot cards, and all. That Poirot raised a finger. I said, I do not believe in false supernatural powers. I believe in the real ones, the kind that exist within the human mind. Okay. The power of fear, a suggestion of belief itself. That, my friend, is the most powerful force of all. I sat back slightly, taken back by his response. In the book, I asked, was it truly about protection from curses? Poirot chuckled. Oh, that book. It was nothing more than a compilation of old folk tales and children's ghost stories purchased from a dusty shelf in a second-hand shop in London. Its purpose was never to ward off spirits. Hastings said it was a tool, a performance. I stared at him, half amused, half incredulous. Performance, may we? He replied. You see, the others, Leo, the workers, even James. Here they were, all under the influence of fear. They believed something otherly was at work. Fear had clouded their judgment, making it easier for the true criminal to operate. I had to fight fear with fear to show them that the so-called spirit could be controlled, broken, and banished. Once that illusion was shattered, it cleared the path for the truth to emerge. James turned slightly, having listened quietly until now. So you never believed in the curse of Poirot? Looked at him kindly. I believe in what people are capable of doing under the illusion of a curse. It is far more dangerous than any ancient spirit. James nodded thoughtfully and turned back to the horizon. He had lost a father, a mentor, and friends, on that expedition, the truth, no matter how logical, would take time to settle, in our journey across the sea. Took several more days from Alexandria to Naples, and then through Paris. We made our way back across the continent, each mile bringing us closer to familiar ground. Poirot, Everett, methodical traveler, had packed with such care that even after weeks of heat, sand, and theater, not a single crease had dared settle on his shirt set. It was late afternoon on a cool spring day. When we finally arrived back in London, the skies were overcast and the city bustled with its usual rhythm, unaware of the ancient drama we had left behind in the desert. Its first stop was Jennifer Howard's home. She met us at the door, eyes wide with anxious anticipation, but the moment she saw James standing beside Poirot, safe and sound, her composure broke. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced her son. "You're safe," she whispered. "Thank God you're safe." Poirot gave them a moment before clearing his throat. "Gently, madame. I believe you had agreed upon a fee." Jennifer quickly composed herself, smiled through her tears, and nodded, "Of course, and not a penny less than what you deserve." She handed him a sealed envelope, thick and tidy, and then extended her hand with deep sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Poirot. You didn't just save my son, you gave me back peace." Pugh gave a small bow. "It is what I do, madam." We bid our farewells and stepped out into the damp London air as we made our way down the street. I couldn't help but smile at Poirot's usual pride in his punctuality, his payment, and his polished shoes back at the flat. Mrs. Hale, Poirot's ever-critical landlady, met us with her usual blend of suspicion and calculation. "You've been gone for weeks," she said, sharply. "Rinse. Do." Poirot, ever prepared, opened his coat pocket and handed her a crisp stack of bills. "And here, it is not a day late." Sniffed at the notes and gave a curt nod. "Welcome back then, I suppose." As she turned and shuffled off, Poirot turned to me with a wry smile. "It is remarkable, Hastings, how even in a city like London, where we think ourselves free of myth and magic, the one force no man dares challenge is the wrath of a landlady." I laughed. "Perhaps that's the only real curse we'll ever face." Poirot sat down his suitcase, straightened a cushion on the armchair, and said, "Still, there is something most satisfying about returning home after a case is closed. Justice was served, the truth revealed, and no phantom to chase." He paused, although, he added, "I would not mind a case involving a ghost one day, just to prove once and for all that it is always the living who haunt us most." And with that, Hercule Poirot sat down with his evening tea, his mustache as pristine as his logic, the shadow of hatchet forever buried, not beneath sand, but beneath truth.